Tell me all about your latest obsession. Are you a fan? Got guilty pleasures? Yeah, your confessions. What the hype? What the hype? Take me from fan to stand. What the hype? What the hype? Ooh, what's the hype? Yeah. What the hype?
Welcome back to What the Hype podcast, where this week things are getting a little bit spicy as we start to dive into the world of smut in romance. I'm Pamela, and I'll be your host today along with Laura, who's also here. Hey, Laura, how's it going?
Hello, I'm great, and I'm so excited for this discussion. I've been looking forward to it all day.
Me too. We've been wanting to do an episode like this for so long, and What the Hype is like the perfect vessel for it. And I'm so excited to announce that we also have a fantastic guest host joining us this week as well. We have author Jennifer Hennessy, who has written a number of fantastic young adult romance books, but she also recently published her first new adult romance book. So she's perfectly primed to weigh in on smut in this genre and like how it's really kind of taken off. I feel like romance never really goes away, but I think it's safe to say smut is having like a moment in the spotlight right now, thanks to BookTok and all that good stuff, right?
Absolutely. And I'm so happy to be here with you guys. I'm so excited to talk all things smutty.
Yes. Well, can you tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself and your books?
Sure. For my young adult novels, I write under my actual name, Jennifer Icapelli, and that tends to center sporty girls doing their thing and falling in love while they do that thing. And then for my adult novels, I write under Jennifer Hennessy, mostly because in my day job, I am a teacher, so I don't need children Googling my name. So I decided to go with a pen name for that. And my adult books tend to center very ambitious women, usually in a career that's either dominated by men or that they have to sort of scrape and claw to get to the top of, and obviously the men that love them for it. So that's what I write.
I love that. Actually, before this, I did a little bit of Google creeping on you, and I read that exact description that it's about ambitious women who know what they want and the men who love them. And I was like, oh my God, that's so refreshing.
It's well, I feel like for a long time, romance novels kind of had this idea that, it was always the damsel in distress and the man that comes and rescues her. And then as time went along, that sort of trope got inverted. And now I'm hoping that it's much more the standard where, women sort of take this role and they are who they are and they don't need to be rescued. They rescue themselves, but also that they're the kind of people who want love in their life. And that's why romance, I feel like, is such a category that will never die. It's, the highest grossing part of publishing and has been for decades, and it will probably continue to be because readers want what they want and they want to watch people fall in love.
Yeah, we're big fans of romance here and romance tropes. I love that like things always end happy, even if you start stressing in the middle. We're team happily ever after here. So
Forever.
That's always nice.
Well, it's so comforting. It's so comforting to know when you're going to pick up a book that it's not going to be doom and gloom. And even if it is, like you said, a little bit in the middle, you're guaranteed that happily ever after, or at least a happily for now, where you feel like, okay, we've left these characters off in a decent place. And now we're ready. I'm happy to let them go and be in love.
Very well said. Well, we're going to kick things off here. We only have a few little words that we wanted to give you all definitions for in case you're listening and you're completely uninitiated. So it's just 3 words that are going to come up here and there throughout our discussion today. The first is smut, which we already used a few times. And that basically it just means like sex or sex scenes, right? I have no idea where it originated, but I feel like this is like a very fandom-y term.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, I also feel like it's maybe slang for the obscene, right? Because we know that smutty material can be very graphic in certain contexts, and it could be that it just developed out of a more negative term. And I like to think that the fandom kind of reclaimed it and was like, fuck yeah, we're smutty. What of it?
Oh, good. We can curse on this podcast.
Oh,
Excellent.
yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. We have 100%. a WTF feed. That's for explicit.
Oh, that's right. There's two different
Yes,
views. Okay, good to know.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
Swear away. But I also feel like this episode is like, it's going to be so hard not to be like dirty
You have
or
to.
explicit. So
I was even like
yeah.
thinking about some of the questions we want to talk about. And I was like, there's no way to say that.
Yeah. You'll know what you're getting into. You know what? You know what this
Prepare
is.
yourselves, everybody.
Exactly. It's only going to go downhill from here. So the next term we have here is romantasy. This is just a combination of romance and fantasy. You'll see this pop up a lot online. Romantasy is having a big moment thanks to titles like Fourth Wing and the A Court of Thorns and Roses series and many other books along that similar line of genre. And then the last term we have is just fan fiction. This is just stuff that's written by fans for no profits.
And it honestly, and I have very limited experience here. I think I'm probably the biggest noob of this panel. Fan fiction in some cases can be some of the smuttiest stuff you will ever read.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. For anyone that doesn't know yet, Laura used to moderate the fan fiction section of MuggleNet back in the day.
Did you really?
I did.
So you've seen some shit.
I've seen things.
You've been through the wars.
Yeah. And, unfortunately, it'd be one thing if there was smut being submitted. I don't have a problem with that. I mean, we had community standards, so we couldn't publish that. But personally, I wouldn't have an issue with that. But people did interesting things. Like we would get stuff and I would be like, did you do this on a dare? Like your Minerva McGonagall giant squid.
I was literally going to say, you probably ran into some giant squid fish.
Yeah, absolutely. Tentacle porn is a thing.
It is.
Probably across a number of different fandoms too. It's the Wild West in fanfiction land, especially if you grew up reading on fanfiction.net like the three of us did and so many other listeners that we have that are going to be tuning in. There was
back when
there were no
fandom
tags.
Yeah. And every fandom had their own website after a while because it was just insane. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, getting back into like the traditional published world of romance, I wanted to ask you both, what is it about romance or romantasy that really draws you in? And what are some things that we particularly love about the genre? We already kind of spoke about the happy ending or the happily ever after for now element, but what else is it that really kind of keeps us reading?
For me, it's a sense of comfort, and it's not just the happily ever after. It's, romance follows a very specific sort of narrative structure, and you kind of know where you're going to go. So I know when I'm picking up a romance novel that I'm in for a very specific journey. And I think that's true for most people who read romance or even romantasy now, which is a hotly debated term and actually got its own category, I think this week in Publishers Marketplace. So in the actual publishing world, in the actual publishing world, they've decided, okay, this is its own thing. And it doesn't happen very often. So that was like, oh, this is maybe going to stick around for a little while, where some things, half fantasy, half romance. But yeah, that's sort of what keeps me coming back, is that I know what I'm getting when I get a romance. And there's so much media out there, books, TV, movies that are constantly trying to like, let's subvert expectations and you thought you were getting this, but actually it's that. Or you signed up for this and, oh no, wait, hard right turn because we need to engage a different demographic or a different audience. But with romance novels, I know what I'm getting. I'm sitting down to be entertained in a very specific way. So that's why I keep coming back to them.
I have to say, like I already mentioned, I'm kind of a noob. I don't have, I think, the level of exposure that a lot of other, romance and romantasy readers have, because it hasn't traditionally been something that's pulled me in. But in recent years, I've started opening up to it more. I mean, really, most recently, I've read things like ACOTAR and Fourth Wing. Obviously way back in the day, we were Twilight girlies. I know me and Pam both were. Jen, I don't know if that was you too.
A little bit.
Yeah. And I feel like of all these things, limited though my experience is, I feel like the thing that really captures me about romance, especially romantasy, is the setting. I feel like these authors, and I think romance authors in general, do such a great job of selling the setting and really making you feel like the scene is lush and detailed, because if the scene's not right and the setting's not right, you're not going to be able to sell the romance. So when I think about Akatar, for example, I mean, I have feelings in about Tamlin in the first book. I don't love him, but I don't think anybody does. But the reason that I was able to stay engaged in that story, even with that, was the environment was so incredible and I was so invested in the rest of everything that was going on. So I feel like romance, I think unfortunately it gets the short end of the stick a lot of the time, with people maybe having the misguided perception that outside of the romance, there's like no substance. And at least with what I've read, I recently got into Bridgerton and binged all of it. It became really clear to me that actually everything else going on around the romance is very consequential. So that helps me stay engaged. I will say that I still struggle with like sex scenes in a lot of these books. They don't really do it for me, and it might be sacrilege to say that because I think I'm an outlier on this, but overall I'm still able to stay really engaged with the stories because the setting itself is so romantic.
I think that a lot of people will relate to that because I think that for some people, they like the world building, especially people that are gravitating towards romantasy. And then the spice or the romance is like the added bonus. It's like the little treat you get along the way with the adventure, you know? And I think that like you hitting the nail on the head with like us being Twilight girlies, I think we did grow up in a very interesting time where we were kind of getting these meteor stories that still had a romance element that was like baked into the plot. And so maybe that's why we're kind of predisposed to that being our gateway into this world. Because I don't think I read like a romance, like a contemporary romance book until I was in my 20s. And that was just because like my friend was a big reader and she was like, you need to read this book. And I was like, okay, I don't have anything else to do. And I was like, oh, it's just like a rom-com, but in a book. And that was the selling point for me. I love a good rom-com. It was the same thing. I am glad though, Laura, that you brought up being taken out of the sex scenes because that was the initial inspiration for this episode, right?
Yes, indeed. I think it started when I think I was reading Akatar and I texted Pam and was like, can I make a confession?
Deep dark secret.
There's just stuff that I know is widely regarded as spicy. And I'm not saying it's not because, we're all different. But I was like, it just doesn't do it for me. And I feel weird. I feel weird because it feels like it does it for everyone else. Just sort of like the way the sex scenes are described, the terminology that's used. Like, I find myself kind of feeling like, okay, like, this is fine, but I'm really interested to get to the next part of the story.
Well, I think that's one of the interesting things about romantasy sort of as its own separate genre is that you have this conversation, and I don't think you're alone. I think there are people who are reading it and going, well, that's fine, but I'm really here for the world building and the fantasy. And there's sort of this, like, the two dragons inside of you where it's like, well, I'm here for the world building. I'm here for the fantasy. I'm here for that stuff. And then, no, I'm here for the romance. And they're just battling each other out. And I think it's actually happening within the category itself of people who wrote fantasy being like, well, there's always kind of been this romantasy thing that existed, romantic fantasy or fantasy romance, whatever you want to call it. And then people who are romance writers who are like, no, but this is what I've been trying to do for years because I was a Twilight girly. I was a Harry Potter girly. And now I'm looking for that just aged up a little bit, like I found on the forums of MuggleNet or Fiction Alley or fanfiction.net or AO3 later on. So I think that's sort of this constant battle, and I don't know who's going to win. I don't know if there is a winner, but I think that there's room for both. If I'm, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's, yeah.
And I guess to that point, I know that Rebecca Yarros, who wrote Fourth Wing, started off as a new adult romance writer. So she has books that she had previously published.
Contemporary new adult.
Yeah,
but,
contemporary.
Yeah.
So clearly, like that is part of her bread and butter, which is, why it makes sense for that to seep into this really like sci-fi dystopian fantasy light kind of world that she's built with Fourth Wing.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the issues, and I was thinking about this when, Pam asked me to come on, and I was like, I think writing smut is a very specific writing muscle. And I actually turned in a book yesterday. I emailed it to my editor. I'm done. And I went back when I was,
Amazing.
oh yeah, I'm very excited. I'm free for the summer. It's so
Congrats.
exciting. Thank you. It doesn't have a title yet. It doesn't have anything I can pitch. Guys, it'll come out eventually. Google me in like a year and there'll be a title up there. But when I was looking at the actual manuscript, it's about 80,000 words, 81,000-ish. And I think there's 8,000 words of smut in it, as we would define smut. It's 10%. It's not a lot. So when you're writing something that's 500 odd pages in a romantasy, say, I don't write romantasy, but that's, you're thinking something along the lines of 100,000 to 120, 50,000 words, depending upon what your publisher will allow you to do. And then maybe the smut takes about 10% of it, and it's just not something you write very often. So it takes a minute before you get good at it, the same way any writing skill takes a minute before you get good at it. And I do wonder if this uptick of romantasy and this uptick of just the churn of trying to satisfy BookTok's need for even new contemporary romance, new, romantasy, whatever, just basic, romance novel genre books. I wonder if everything's being turned out a little too fast and if people aren't taking the time to work on their craft as much as they possibly can, because that's key. That's when I get pulled out of a sex scene, is when I'm sitting there being like, this doesn't really match the quality of writing. And, the author is fantastic. They're really good. They build a beautiful world, whether it's contemporary or fantasy. I'm sucked in and I'm ready to go. And then we hit the 55% mark and somebody's hooking up. And I'm like, wait a minute, this isn't as good as your other writing. And that's what pulls me out as I'm reading stuff like that.
That is such an interesting observation. And I love that you brought up, the very small percentage of smut that can realistically make up the total of your word count. Do you feel like when it comes to smut and even just general sex scenes, less is more?
I think it depends on what you're writing.
Okay.
So I think in a lot of it gets mushed together, especially in this BookTok world where in publishing, we know the difference between something that's a romance novel and something that's erotica, or however you want to categorize it. But there's something that's like, no, this is like almost fully smut. And then there's other things where it's like, no, this is a narrative in which smut exists. And so some people come at it where they're like, oh, no, most of the story is smut. And then they come to a different book and they're like, hey, hang on, how come this isn't 80% smut like the book I just read? So I do think for me, I write contemporary romance. So for me, yeah, less is more, where you're really honing in on that buildup, on that tension, on all of the stuff, which is generally more fun for the audience than the actual act of, writing the actual smut content. The same thing for if you're writing something that's, general media for television. Even the smuttiest of the smut shows, if you want to label them that way, where you're watching nearly pornography sex scenes, but not quite. How much of a percentage does that take up in your show? Usually not very much. So if you're going to do it and it's hard to do well, you probably are better served by limiting the sheer amount of it, unless you're writing erotica, in which case the audience has signed up for constant badgering of smut in their face on their
Right.
page. So I think that's really where the balance lies.
Well, I want to dive more into this, but before we do that, we do have to take a little break to pay the bills so that we can continue being smutty, dirty, smutty people on this episode. So we'll be right back.
I figure we can maybe get a little bit more specific about what it is that takes us out of it. Jen, you shared that it's when you can tell someone hasn't really honed their craft and you can tell like this doesn't really match up with the rest of your writing or what I've seen from you before. And that gives me something to think about for sure. That might actually be the larger issue that, we're experiencing. We just don't know it. But I think for me, where it all started was the euphemisms, especially in romantasy. There are so many euphemisms, and I'll just give y'all some examples. Things like fleshy lance, velvet steel and burying his fleshy lance to the hilt.
I'm sorry.
Basically, it's all dicks as swords analogies. And I'm
Which is
tired
funny
of it.
because it's funny because you would think that that would be such like a man thing to do. Be like, yes, my dick is a sword, but it's women who are writing
Yes.
these things. Unless they all have male editors and like we just don't know. That's like the
Oh, no.
worst kept secret.
And they're mostly female editors. I would
Yeah,
guess it tends
but
to be that
it's
way.
just so funny. Am I wrong though? Like it does feel like a man thing, right?
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
But like, although I feel like most women don't wander around thinking about what to call other guys' dicks. Like they're
That's
not.
true.
Like, that's a man
No.
thing. That men are thinking about that. Women are not.
Yeah.
It's like why guys draw dicks on stuff when they're little, like when they're in high school and they're like and women
true.
aren't wandering around drawing boobs on everything. Like it's our brains maybe aren't wired that way.
It's a diplomatic way of putting it. So I guess when it comes to these kinds of euphemisms, and there are certainly way more than the ones I just shared, you can find long ass lists if you Google it. But what is the purpose of this? Is it in an effort to make things sound more romantic, sexier, more mysterious in a way, rather than just calling it what it is?
I feel like maybe it's an attempt to match the tone of the rest of the book. I personally, as soon as I hit a euphemism, I'm out. Like it's just not for
Yeah.
me, which is why I have a hard time finding romantasy that I like. It's an issue for me because I'm desperate to dive into the romantasy genre in its fully developed worlds that I've loved since I was a little girl that are sort of taking those things on, but aging it up. And I can't find any because of the euphemisms. They drive me crazy. I think that's probably what it is. It's probably an attempt to match the rest of the book. But what I've found is that it doesn't. When you have it really doesn't. When you have a character that hasn't spent the entirety of the previous however long leading up to the sex scene not speaking in euphemisms about anything, and then we get to the sex scene and their point of view is chock full of them, I'm like, no. I think that's what I was talking about more with the craft thing, where your voice has to stay the same. Your character's voice, not you as a writer necessarily, but your character's voice has to stay the same. And if you have somebody who is, very naive maybe and doesn't understand the mechanics of sex, if you're dealing with a virgin character, which a lot of times you are in romantasy, they're not thinking in euphemisms. They're thinking in either maybe clinical terms for the world that they're in or slang. Because we all think in slang. And so, I always think back to Battlestar Galactica with their word frack, which they slipped everything past the SEC. No one was coming for them. They cursed all the time on that show, but no one ever said anything because they created their own slang term. I'm a big fan of slang terms in every genre, as long as you're matching the world that you've built. And those I'm usually comfortable with. But when it becomes this flowery language and you're not reading the rest of it in the flowery language, that's where I get like, no, hard pass for me. Either I'll skip it and just hope the sex scene isn't critical to the plot, or I'm just like, I'm out.
Yeah. I mean, like you just saying flowery language kind of that clicks in my brain because I'm thinking if I'm somebody that has like never written a sex scene in my life, then I would assume probably that I need to make it probably superfluous in an effort to make it seem more romantic. But I feel like with writing, sometimes less is more. And you really kind of have to pick and choose your moments, right? When you want to extrapolate on something and when it's better to pull back.
No, for sure. And I think a lot of times what happened too is whether it's written in first person or third person, for whatever reason, sex scenes devolve into sort of like a narrator, even if you're still inside the character's point of view. And you don't want that in that moment where the person's the most vulnerable. They're with somebody else. They're exposing themselves to somebody else in many ways in those particular situations. You want to hear their voice and not a narrator voice and not a general voice or a poetic voice you've literally never heard before from this particular character. So I think that's where people get caught up. And again, it's difficult because it's not a muscle you stretch all the time with your writing. You really have to work at it, and you really have to write a lot of it. And I was lucky that I just wrote a lot of fanfic with a lot of smut. So my muscle was fully stretched. I was like, oh no, I know how to do this part. It's the other stuff I'm going to have to work on, but the smutty stuff I can do for sure. I've been writing that since I was 15. I'm good.
See, kids, fan fiction, it helps you in this world.
It does. It does. It doesn't help you in some ways, but that's one of the ways it'll get you through.
Yeah. It's a great playground to that point. I mean, I think that that's a great way to flex like your writing muscle in general, even if you don't want to write romance.
Oh, for sure.
And you get like real-time feedback from people.
Which you cannot get if you publish in real life. If you are a traditionally published author, and even sometimes a self-published author, depending upon how much you want to engage with your audience, it's a hard no on really talking to readers unless they're gushing at you in excitement. So with, I went similar to the MuggleNet. I was in the Harry Potter fandom. I came up through the grueling ship war trenches because the fourth book had only come out when I joined the Harry Potter fandom. So there was a lot of stuff going down back then.
Long wait.
Yeah, a long wait. And it was, you really had to hone your craft because people were not afraid to be like, this sucks, try again. And they were not as nice as that.
Yeah. I mean, internet comment sections have always been brutal.
Yeah.
They're actually like, I feel like they're a little bit nicer now. Sometimes I poke through the comments
they're
on
way
AO3.
Nicer now.
And do you know, this is kind of getting like off topic, but I think that the difference is because Archive of Our Own was like created by people that came from fandom and fan fiction, and they don't call their comments reviews, they call them comments. But
I catch myself doing that.
Yeah. Fanfiction.net was always leave a review. And when you say review, people are like, well, let me add them. Like, let me just tear this to shreds. You asked for a review. I'm giving it to you.
Yeah.
Comment is like so much nicer. It's like, comment and tell me what you thought.
I do wonder, every once in a while, I wonder about people who do like academic work on fandom spaces. And I want somebody to study that. What do people say when they say comment versus review? I want to know. No one will do that.
Yeah.
No one will do their like master's thesis on it, but I want to.
Do they have like an ask box? They do so much over on AO3 or like transformative works or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to make it sound like we're reviewing romantasy too critically here, because again, there are aspects of romantasy I really, really like. This is just one of them I still have some difficulty with. And I'm wondering if romantasy fans would say, you're taking it too seriously. This is an aspect of the genre that you don't understand. It's meant to be tongue in cheek. Do we get the impression that that's how most readers who enjoy this type of smut feel about it and regard it in terms of how it comes across in romantasy?
I think
because they're hyping it up. They're like, oh, this is the hottest book I've ever read. And I get that everybody speaks in hyperbole, especially on TikTok. But when they say that, you're expecting the hottest thing you've ever read. So if it falls flat for you, I don't think that that's your fault fully.
And we all come from a different space. Not everyone is reading ACOTAR and it's the first romantasy or really even smutty scene they've ever read. Like you said, if you went through the trenches of MuggleNet's fan fiction and you were moderating that and you're like, well, that's definitely not the most erotic thing I've ever seen, because it's just not what's being acquired by editors in the romantasy genre. And I know we were talking before about, are they male editors? Is that why? Publishing in general is populated by white women between the ages of 30 and 50. They have very specific taste.
Interesting.
The demographic is usually people who can afford to take that job because they don't pay very well until you get, higher up in that sort of corporate ladder. So you're dealing with a very similar demographic that's buying the same things over and over again. And then the other explanation is capitalism, in which case, everything's explained by capitalism. But, like because it's sold before, they're going to buy more of it. So now you're dealing with this sort of vicious cycle of you're getting similar things over and over again. And there are things that are different. And I think this is my like weird romance genre author opinion, where I think that what we're going to see is what's going to happen is people who have been writing fantasy romance for years, because it has been a thing for a very long time. And I know they get all like, hey, we've been doing this for a while, when people sort of say, oh, it's a new thing. It's not. It's existed. It's just been packaged very differently than the romantasy we're seeing right now. It was in mass market paperback. It was in Walmart. It was in,
Avon.
Yeah, exactly. Where you have these, these imprints that have been doing this and catering to a very specific audience. As the late Gen X, early millennial people start to cross into the mid 30s, into 40s, you're going to start to see it marketed. Well, I'm 39 to us, where we're the Twilight Harry Potter girlies. So we need to be told, hey, this is kind of the stuff that you grew up with. And we're going to point it at you versus the people that maybe came from the bodice ripper generation. And then they had, I think we're seeing this shift, but we're living through it. So we're kind of like, oh,
so
wait,
much
what's
sense.
going on here? Yeah. Where we have
like
this
that
sense
you
of
said
confusion.
That. Because I was just going to ask you, and you've already answered this, that if you feel like there's going to come a point where there's enough turnover, we're going to start seeing new things ushered in as a result of, like the older people in this industry retiring. Like,
right.
The same thing happens with politics too. Sometimes you have to wait for things to age out until
Exactly.
you see real change. But
except in politics, that never happens because they never die.
I know. Everybody gets
our healthcare system is way too good. We keep keeping these people alive.
Yeah. But to that point, I read Romancing Mr. Bridgerton to prep for like all the Bridgerton stuff. And like, I don't think I had read really like a bodice ripper. If I had, it has been a while since I had. And the tone of that is way different. And I was thinking about it. I was like, why do I not like this? And it's like, it's because this was written in like the 90s.
Right.
This is literally your mother's romance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so which is why you get that divide between the people who are the book devotees in Bridgerton and the people who are like, no, I'm happy to see the TV show modernizing and updating and doing all these changes, because the people, they've been holding on to that book for 30 years. I know I don't think of the 90s as 30 years ago, but it really was. It's unfortunate, but it is. But it is. And so we're seeing it and we go, hey, I don't really like this, even though we fully bought in with the television show. So I think we're seeing that change. We're just, unfortunately, we're living through the change. And so sometimes there's a disconnect there.
Such as the crutch of the millennial generation. Honestly, we just have to like live through change constantly.
Changing all the time. Are we having another once in a lifetime event that's happened 8 times?
Unprecedented.
We are all just Ben Affleck standing there with a cigarette,
with the Duncan,
and the Duncan, yeah. Just getting back to the descriptors and the euphemisms and all the things we're talking about that take us out of it, would these sex scenes be better if we swapped some of those descriptors out for more clinical terms? And saying clinical also makes me feel like, that feels like too much, because that's like, I don't need, everything to be literal, but it's nice to have some stuff left to the imagination and implied without necessarily being like, my dick is Excalibur,
And you don't necessarily want like take tab A and then slot it in just
right, exactly.
Yeah.
Like, what's the middle ground here?
I think it's what I was talking about before. I think it's slang. I think slang terms coupled with slightly more general physical descriptions. Like, I'll use an example, and we're not going to be able to avoid using actual terminology here, so I'm going for it. If I say somebody presses forward between somebody's legs, you know what I mean.
100%.
I don't have to say his dick is going into her vagina. Like, I don't have to say that, But unless you know where he is physically present, you're not going to know what's happening. So I think there's that sort of happy medium between describing physical action and then describing physical action. Where you have to sort of find that balance. And again, it's a writing muscle. It's a thing that you need to work at, and you're only using it about 10% of the time in your, especially for me at least, contemporary romance. But in fantasy romance, are probably similar, not that much more. So it's really a hard balance to find. But yeah, I don't think clinical terms are the answer unless you're writing like Christina Yang fan fiction, where she would like be like horrified if somebody. I think in the show notes you wrote something about Grey's Anatomy somewhere in there about using. Yeah, I know I'm probably not supposed to be citing them, but here I am.
No, it's all good. We do that all the time.
So like if Christina Yang was like, "You're calling your dick what exactly?" No, get out of my bedroom.
Yeah,
like so she would probably be like, "No, that's your penis, that's my vagina. Let's get going." but then you have to match it to your character, which is what we were talking about
Right.
before, where if it doesn't make sense for the character 10 pages before the smut, don't use it again inside the smut scene. And again, it's just something you have to work at. It's hard. No pun intended. It's hard.
Yeah, I mean, to your point about like less is more, something that I like, and I didn't realize this until I was like trying to figure out exactly what I did like in romance or in spicy scenes, is like it would be more like she takes him in hand or something like that.
I use him and her a lot. It does a lot of heavy lifting.
Yeah, no pun intended. No, because if you're setting the scene, to your point, like, then you don't need to be descriptive unless like that's part of your plot, right? Or if you're writing erotica where like you probably do want to be way more
where the reader
descriptive.
has signed up for you to be super, super, super descriptive, graphic. Yeah. And that's again, like we said earlier in the show, everyone has their own preferences. Everyone's allowed to enjoy what they want to enjoy. As long as you're marketing yourself that way and you're saying, hey, no, I write whatever, and there's that chili pepper scale, but like, hey, I rate, 2.5 to 3 chili peppers is probably where mine falls in that 1 through 5 scale. And then some people are like, hey, I'm looking for 5. And that's probably erotica where you're, 80% of the book is sex. But yeah, I feel like you can find that happy medium if you're looking for something sort of in between. And if your book is written in the in-between where, a guy's not walking around going, I'm going to plunge my sword into her, again, 10 pages before the actual scene happens. If he's never thought that way before, maybe not during the actual sex scene.
Do you know, something else that kind of takes me out sometimes, and I'm sure you two can agree, is like when you can't figure out exactly the logistics of like what is going where. And then it's like, it's almost like you have to like turn the book. It's like, what is happening?
Count the limbs, count the fingers, how many arms, how many legs.
It's like, can your hand move this way?
Right. And I think to your point before, Laura, where you're talking about, hey, we've all bought in and we're here for fantasy, not for realism. There's a certain amount of leeway you have with that, where like maybe in real life, he wouldn't be able to hold her up for the full half hour against the wall. But like, it's fiction, so it's okay. Yeah. But when he grows an extra limb, unless it's sci-fi, maybe not. Like you have to find those two. Like you have to find that space between those two things where your readers have bought into a certain point, but there is a point at which they're going to abandon you. They're going to be like, "No, sorry, that's too much. Not physically possible."
Yeah, it's like knowing what the limits of people's suspension of disbelief is going to be, just in general. Yeah, I agree.
Mm-hmm. Because, yeah, I've definitely read stuff where people have had like 3 legs suddenly. And I'm like, no, that can't be.
Oh, it's like you missed one.
How does that
happen? Some editor somewhere along. And that's a craft thing. That's an editor not catching it. That's an author not thinking it clearly through. And, when you have the genre as big as it is with so much money involved, that's what's going to happen sometimes. It's unfortunate, but it's what's going to happen sometimes.
Well, we're going to take another quick break and let you all take a little breather. And we'll be back with more smutty talk right after this. So we're going to switch gears a tiny little bit. And because we have Jen on, I really wanted to talk about smut for publishing versus smut for fan fiction. And I think that this conversation is really going to resonate with a lot of people because I know we have quite a few people in fandom who listen to our show. And also fan fiction has probably like never been more popular on the main stage. Like the number of people that just openly talk about fan fiction nowadays is insane to me, but here we are.
It makes me so happy.
Yeah.
It
and
does.
Also like there's a lot of crossover now. You're seeing a lot more writers going from the fan fiction space into like the published author space. So it's a really interesting time.
I don't know if it's more crossover or like you said, it's just an okay
it's
thing
just like
to
more
talk
openly,
about now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I'm in a lot of author circles. I've been in YA circles. Now I'm in romance circles. And most of the people I know have at some point published fan fiction online, if they're between the ages of 25 and 45, which is generally my friend group. Yeah, they have. They just don't talk about it. And the people that do talk about it are the people who are probably trying to draw their own fanfic audience to their eventual published book. But it's exciting.
Mm-hmm.
It's cool to be like, hey, this nerdy, incredible thing that I had to hide when I was 15 is now like just fine.
That's the thing. Honestly, when I was 15, I wouldn't tell a damn soul that I wrote fan fiction or that I read fan fiction. Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It was embarrassing. It shouldn't have been, but it was.
Yeah, because you were doing this cool creative writing project.
And nobody would understand it. They'd be like, why don't you write your own stories? And it's like,
I
well,
used to get that all the time.
I'm just using other people's characters and settings.
You should have been like, I'm stretching my muscle.
I'm stretching my creative muscles. I had an argument with my creative writing teacher in high school, and I told him I should be allowed to write fan fiction in his class because that's what TV writers do. And I was like, TV writers aren't the creators of their world. They write episodes of TV. And he looked at me like, I don't care, kid. Write whatever you want. Like, I was like, I should be allowed to do this. And he's like, it's fine. I'm not going to fight with you. It's just do the assignment. But
Honestly,
it is.
That tells me that he thought you had a good point and he just didn't want to admit it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of fanfic, we found this really great tweet from user Sarah Demp, or X as it's otherwise known. Sarah Demp says, BookTok made so much more sense to me when I realized that most of them are people who are only just now having their middle school smutty fanfiction phase. And it's true. I think. Yeah.
At least there's a nugget of truth in it, where I think it used to be, like we were talking about before, the bodice rippers in the supermarket and Walmart. You got to a certain age and you're like, oh, that's what I'm interested in reading. But now you can tell everybody, and literally everybody, not just, your friends in your mom group around the corner or whatever. You can be like, hey, I found this book, and the whole world's going to hear about it.
Yeah. Well, I think it also lends probably for people who, either didn't want to talk about being involved in fan fiction or just never allowed themselves to get involved in fan fiction because of the social stigma that used to be there. Now that this stuff is very mainstream being published, it lends it a degree of credibility for people who may have felt that way in the past. Somebody's not going to judge you if they see you just sitting and reading a book and they don't know what the book's about. They're just going to assume, hey, whatever that is, it's published work. They're just a little less self-conscious about it.
Well, the cover designs really help with that. I know we've talked about that before on Millennial as well, just like the nondescript, almost like cartoonish covers. It doesn't really sometimes look like what is actually inside the book. So I think that helps.
Yeah. And I think that's also particularly true for romantasy, where you do get much more traditional fantasy looking covers in general. Maybe a special edition will come out with something a little bit more racy or cartoony or whatever. But, you're looking at Iron Flame, and actually that doesn't look like there's going to be smut inside of it.
That looks cool.
It looks really cool. It looks like something fun to read. So you're not necessarily getting, like we talked about before, those bodice rippers with the girl half naked and the guys with the hair flowing and all that good stuff. So people don't feel embarrassed.
I think a lot of it too is just that, like, unfortunately, men's interests are taken way more seriously than women's interests always. And fantasy has a lot of sci-fi as well, has a lot of male fans. And so that's deemed as more acceptable, which is why covers like that probably seem more acceptable subconsciously, even sometimes to society, versus something that would have like a Fabio traditional painted cover on it.
Which is a whole other conversation in publishing that we constantly are having of like, hey, is this genre being represented properly? Are we hiding the sexy part of it with, the cutesy cartoon covers? There's even the conversation of, does it look too YA sometimes, where like, and I don't know, it's publishing, it's trends. There's very little we can do to fight it. It's capitalism, like I said before. If it makes money, it's going to continue to make money. They're going to continue to do the same thing.
You actually made me curious about another question we had jotted down for you. And it was around the differences between how smut is written for fanfic and how it's written for traditional publishing. I found myself wondering this a little bit earlier when we were talking about euphemisms and colorful language. Like, are there certain publishing standards that authors kind of have to adhere to in order for their publishing house to put their work out there? Whereas with fan fiction, there are no such requirements.
Right.
You
just
can
make sure you tag it is basically the fanfic requirement.
Exactly.
Personally, I've never had any strictures put on me. Nobody's ever said, hey, you can't write this particular thing. But then again, I am sort of in that like 2.5 to 3 chili pepper stage where no one's like, whoa, what are you writing here? There's never been that conversation personally for me. I'm sure at some point someone has been told, oh, no, we're not going there. As far as writing for fanfic versus writing for publishing, I think fanfic's just so much easier. I really do. You know how we were talking before how, using euphemisms and drawing people out of the story. And I feel like with fanfic, when you have an audience with your fanfic, they've already bought in. They're already there for the thing that you're writing. You don't have to set up the potential buy-in before they get to the sex scene. I know when I go to AO3, I click on the whatever media I'm interested in reading about. I find the little ship tag. I click the ship tag. I scroll till I find something that sounds like, oh, that looks like the summary looks like somebody who knows how to write. The word count seems right. There's a lot of tags here that fit kind of what I'm looking for. I'm going for it. I have already self-selected. In traditional publishing, an editor and an agent has kind of selected for us. And like we were talking about before, the demographics are very limited as to who gets those jobs and who keeps those jobs. So I think that's probably what we're seeing with the similarities of we're having people sort of filter it through a lens of, hey, what's going to sell, what's going to make money. Like you said, versus fanfic where you just post whatever you want and nobody tells you no. But I think it's just easier with the fanfic because your audience has already bought in. Your audience is already like, I'm here for this specific thing, and I know you're probably going to give it to me. And maybe your writing's not super up to snuff, but I can fill in the blanks with my own love of these characters and everything else that I'm already bringing to this. Versus in traditional publishing or even self-publishing, where you need to do all of that work yourself. And if you don't succeed, the sex scene's not going to hit for them, and that's back again to a craft thing. If you haven't done all of the things you need to do to have people buy into the couple, it's just not going to hit right. And maybe even regardless of whether it's like so euphemistic or whether it's slang or whether it's that like, vague language, it's still not going to work.
So is that why it kind of does feel like, fan fiction has sort of ruined us for the spicy book talk boom? Because I know Laura and I have mentioned this to each other privately where, we've said like some of the best Smut we've ever read is in fan fiction. And I guess that's not to take away of like the caliber of writing that you can get through fan fiction.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, but you're maybe like you raise a good point, which is that it's not that like one has ruined you for the other. It's just that you're more emotionally invested in the characters you're reading about.
You're already there, and you're probably willing to forgive a little bit more to get more of the content that you're looking for, or the fix-it content that you're looking for, or the, hey, this never actually happened in canon, but I'm here for it. Oh, look, so are other people content. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
Which is why I will
so
always love
interesting.
fanfic.
Yeah. No, that's such a good point. Authors have a tough job.
It's not easy.
In this regard.
Yeah. It's really not easy. And it's really hard to get good at it, which is why it's publishing is really hard because you only get a couple of chances to build an audience before publishing is like, bye.
Do you get a feeling when you know that like something's going to hit once you get to the spicy scenes, or like, do you kind of have like a premonition of like something's not going to work? Like this is not going to work
as a
because I have
writer?
to fix this first. Yes.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It actually happened to me last week. I was finishing up this book and I had a spicy scene that I had to write. And I was like, wait, I'm going to write the rest of the book first because I need to see how my writer brain is going to allow this to play out, the actual plot of the book where, there is an actual plot in this book. And it's completely removed for the most part from the sex scenes. So I was like, I'm going to watch this play out and then I'm going to go back and I'm going to write it. And I felt like I was almost like having like an out of body experience where I'm like, oh, I'm going to let my writer brain do the plot thing and then I'm going to write it. And it worked way better because I was sitting there staring at the blinking cursor being like, I don't think I can do this right now. And then when I went back, I was like, oh no, I'm ready. I know exactly where they are emotionally. I know exactly where they are in this journey that they're going to take. And I know where they're going now. And I can sort of trace my steps backwards and work that way. There have been times where I've scrapped stuff completely, where I've been writing a smut scene and I've been like, this isn't working. Don't know why, but I'm going to start over from scratch and ignore the fact that I just wrote that part because it's bad. It's bad. It's almost like, not to make too fine a point of it, but it's almost like actually hooking up with a person where you're like, ooh, I thought this was going to be
not great.
Right. And you think
Yeah.
you have a connection with someone and then you absolutely do
Uh-huh.
not. And it's like, well, okay,
Yeah.
bye.
Yeah. Oh,
Which
man.
ties really well to your earlier point at the beginning of the episode when you said like the buildup is sometimes more important than the actual sex. Sometimes I feel that way even about
Mhm.
books that, just do kissing and fade to black. Like if the buildup is not there before the first kiss, then it's like, oh,
Wah,
okay,
wah.
that's a thing that
Like,
happened.
yeah.
Yeah.
You're like,
We're just-
okay, they did that.
They
Yeah.
did that.
I really honestly think I think it's always more important. I think when you get to the point, it should feel like coming down the roller coaster, not the
Yeah, you
build
want
up
the
on
butterflies.
yeah, the build up of the roller coasters are we're never actually gonna feel like we're flying. But the build up to that top of the roller coaster, maybe this time.
Mhm.
Maybe
Yeah.
this time I'm gonna take off. Like,
Anticipation.
yeah, for sure. I think that's the most important part. So I think if you can deliver even a sliver of that level of expectation that you set, you're probably doing a good job. But yeah, sometimes it's just not going to happen, and you got to start over. And then sometimes it's like, oh, okay, we're good. Moving on. We're good to go.
Well, Jen, thank you so much for joining us today. This was so much fun. And I think you've given not only Laura and me, but people that listen to this episode in the future, I think you've given us all a lot to think about in terms of the mechanics and maybe why certain scenes don't hit in some books and then they do in others. So, where can our listeners find you online if they want to go hang out with you?
You can find me everywhere, all social media at Jennifer Carolyn, just spelled the way you normally would spell it. And at my website, it's either jenniferhennessy.net or Jennifer C. Icapelli, which is very long, IACOPELLI.com.
And your book, Degrees of Engagement, comes out in paperback in the US next month, right?
It does. It's out in ebook now and in paperback also in the UK and all the Commonwealth, and it'll come out in the US in August. It is about a young woman, Bianca, who has just finished her PhD, and she throws herself a party to celebrate, and none of her friends and family show up, even though she has, I know, how dare they? But I feel like it's a thing that happens to people who, especially people who
Yeah.
have shown up for every bridal shower and baby shower and wedding and destination bachelorette and all the things that, are part of being a woman in your 20s and 30s. And so to get revenge on her family and to sort of prove a point to them, she gets fake engaged to a very handsome fellow grad student who has been her academic rival during the study of her PhD. And they react exactly how she thought they would. They're super excited for her and throw her a party and have a great time. And so obviously the revenge scheme keeps on going for a little while. And while that's playing out, she might be falling in love with him a little bit as they go along. But unfortunately, their lives are going to take them in different directions. So they have to figure that out. And will they? Yes, they will, because it's a romance novel and you're going to get a happily ever after. But you have to read it to find out how.
I'm
Well, listen,
invested
you
now.
teed up fake dating and I'm there.
Fake dating, forced proximity,
I hear
all
there's
that
only
good
one
stuff.
bed at some point.
At one point, there's only one bed. There's a couch, but doesn't sound as nice as a bed.
We'll take it.
Yeah. Well, listen, when there's an option and they don't take the option, that's even more fun sometimes.
Well, thank you again so much for coming on today, Jennifer, and thank all of you at home for listening. We are a new show, so we do need your support. First of all, follow us in your podcast app and leave a review. This is going to help make the show a success. It's super important in the early days of a show. And actually, here's a review from a listener named Zazzy who says, "It's so fun to have another show with these hosts. It always feels like listening to friends. They really do their research. I love listening to their hot takes and connecting the threads. It's just fun all around. Would highly recommend. Peace and love."
Aw.
So sweet.
A review,
Thank you.
too, not a
Sweet.
comment. It was a review and
Exactly.
it was nice.
Yeah.
A nice review.
Yes.
Be sure to follow us on social media as well. We're on TikTok, YouTube, Twitch, and Instagram as What the Hype Podcast. Our website is whatthehypepodcast.com. On X, we are What the Hype Show. And if you want to email us about anything at all, you can drop us a line at whatthehypepodcast@gmail.com. There's also a contact form and a voicemail option on our website. So you can take advantage of that as well if you want.
And do you know a friend or family member who's obsessed with pop culture? Be sure to share this episode with them, assuming that they're into the spicy content, and tell them that we're walking through every aspect of pop culture each and every week. But that's all for today. That's the hype on smut and romantasy and romance. Really, really enjoyed having this chat with y'all today, and we'll see y'all next week with a brand new episode. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.